Welcome to another episode of the Carnage and Apricorn Show. Today I have Justin Duke. I came across him from an article he wrote on buying companies. So this is an area that I'm exploring. So I thought it'd be good to just riff on what it's like, what he's done, what he's learned, and see where the conversation takes us. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
To get started, can you walk us through your journey into Third South Capital? Why did you decide to do it? And where is it today?
So, to go all the way back to the beginning, I come from what I would describe as like a pretty conventional or stereotypical big tech background of graduated undergrad, worked at Amazon for 4 years. I wanted to see how like really big companies worked and like get skill and improvement as a software engineer. And then I wanted to jump to a startup. So worked at like a pre-seed Series A size place for a little bit, and then worked at Stripe for the last 4 years. And did the whole gamut of what I would describe as like the conventional tech whirlpool, right? Of seeing companies that are going through that VC cycle at various stages. And I learned a lot, and I'm really grateful for my time in that part of my career. But I knew that it wasn't what I was the most excited about. I really liked working with independent businesses, with like smaller businesses, what often the industry would call, like in a disparaging way, quote unquote, lifestyle businesses, right? Things that have been operating for years or decades, are usually maybe a couple people, maybe a couple dozen employees, not on the larger side, not going to be some sort of $1 billion exit, but are like very healthy and very profitable and very stable. And for a while, my goal was to sort of build one of those companies, of something where I felt like I had a lot of agency and I had a lot of ownership and I could forge my own way. And in the path of doing that, I realized that there were a lot of folks on that journey as well. Maybe they were still scaling up their company a little bit. Maybe they had reached the terminal size of that company for a while, where it's like something with 20, 30, 40K MRR, like pays a really good salary, but there's no real path for it to grow any larger than that. And they were just bored of it. And the death knell for a lot of companies that fit that profile is not like getting disrupted by a huge competitor or like the unit costs fall out or anything like that. It's literally the founder just getting bored of answering their emails day after day after day. And so like they start on something new and that business slowly atrophies and like succumbs to bit rot, or they sell it to like someone who is, for lack of a better term, like nefarious, like they're doing it more as strategic, where they just want the user data. They don't actually care about the value that the business is generating. And I started chatting with two of my long-term and great friends, Colin and Harrison, who are my partners at Third South, about like what a fund sort of oriented around finding those kinds of businesses and really operating them for stewardship rather than growth, what that could entail of, hey, here's this kind of asset that it's hard for institutional companies to really buy or operate at scale, because a lot of them are so small that it's not worth the fixed cost for like a Constellation or a really, really large institutional roll up to handle. But it's still like a valuable business. It's providing use and value to its users and customers. It is doing good in the world, and it's better that someone operates it, even if it's not the original founding team. And with that thesis, we just spent like a solid couple months surveying the landscape of, I'm sure you're aware of like the acquire.coms of the world and some of the brokerages, and just seeing what was out there and slowly refining like what we liked in certain businesses, what we didn't, to the point where last year, 2023, we ended up acquiring a total of 5 businesses, all fitting that profile of pretty small, mostly operated by the original founder who just wanted to do something else, like wasn't interested in operating it any further, but there was still something we could do with the business beyond like mind the store. We either saw opportunities for product improvements or some pricing strategy changes, things along those lines. And the journey from sourcing to closing to like onboarding and operating has been really, really fulfilling and really, really fun.
I came across this idea because I saw that a company bought Meetup, and I was like, whoa, Meetup is such an iconic brand, and it's just so massive for the impact it had on the internet. And then I saw that same company bought Evernote, and I was like, oh man, I still use Evernote. What a great app. I think there is a great market for smaller apps, digital, that The founder wants to move on, but it's still pretty solid business. My thesis is very similar to yours, which is our generation, rather than buying a boring business like a laundromat, can buy digital apps. That's more akin to what we've done. And from the skill set that we've developed working with internet companies at scale, we can translate that into other apps that we enjoy and want to add value or improve. So I think it's a great model. And what got me really interested in it is the cash flow aspect as well. If it can help pay for other businesses or ideas, investing into a company or paying a salary, it's even better because it's just so hard to get an idea to work, any idea. So be able to shortcut that and get right into the meat of it, I think it's very attractive. So I guess my first question is 5 businesses, was that a lot of work? Did you plan to acquire 5? Do you plan on acquiring more? What was that whole process like?
For sure. We worked backwards really from a fund size of like, here's this amount of capital between the three of us that we're interested in allocating. And we sort of said, I think a little bit flippantly at the time, whether this goes into a single company or a half dozen, like this is the right shape of investment that we want to make. And I think there are really compelling arguments for and against diversification. We like the fact that we got to mitigate a huge amount of like platform risk and all of the risks inherent in quote unquote putting all your eggs in one basket by having relatively diffuse investments. The companies in our portfolio, the characteristics of the users are pretty similar. They're all in the prosumer or SMB space, but they're not all on the same platform. So it's not a situation where if we wake up next month and like Shopify has removed their app store or whatever, then suddenly our entire thesis is underwater. We've got a pretty good amount of risk mitigation there. I think candidly, one of the things that we didn't anticipate when we decided to go for as many companies as we did was the raw switching costs involved in terms of like not even an operational standpoint, but just a strategy standpoint of having to think about multiple companies that all have their own unique characteristics and challenges relative to just one or two or three where you can switch a little bit easier. We're all doing this from the perspective of strategic triage, right? Where in a given month or a given quarter, what are the couple highest impact things we can do across the entire portfolio? And when we're looking at it through that lens, it's just harder to dedicate time to any one specific business. So I think from that perspective, you asked if we're planning on acquiring more. The answer is yes, but I think going forward, we want to up the average deal size and decrease the quantity a little bit, just so that any given investment we make has a relatively outsized impact, as opposed to us like doubling the run rate of a given business, but then sort of taking a step back and being like, oh, well, if you look at that amortized across our entire portfolio, that's only like 10%, right?
Yeah.
Being able to put, there's a cliche, right? Putting more feathers or more wood behind fewer arrows or whatever. I think going forward, that's where we want to go. Though it's one of the bittersweet things of some of our smaller or like more esoteric businesses are also the ones that we're most passionate about and it's most fun to tinker with. So it's very much there are pros and cons on each side, I think.
Yeah. Can you walk us through high level what were the 5 businesses, and maybe we can talk through the last one that you acquired and how, like what that process was like?
Of course. And this is in no order because
Yeah.
in one of those true moments of when it rains, it pours, like we ended up closing on the 5 businesses all within a span of 6 to 8 weeks of one another. We had this slow and methodical sourcing process, and we just happened to find a lot of stuff that crossed our desk that we really liked all at the same time, to the point where we were like, do we need to take a step back and say no to a couple of these deals, not because of the business, but because of our circumstances? We ended up not doing that. We had that moment of like, do we have too many things that we're juggling at the same time? To walk you through the businesses that we have, we run, and this really spreads the gamut, starting with some of our smaller ones and then moving larger. Our smallest and perhaps our favorite is called icon.horse. It's a tiny dev tool. It's a dev tool for extracting favicons or structured like OG data around a given URL. And it was one of those things where it solved a clear need. I stumbled upon it not through a sourcing platform, but because I was looking for something similar for my personal business. I was really impressed with the tool. cold reached out to the owner, started a conversation around like, well, what would an acquisition look like? And when a business is that independent, that small, where it has a really good stable of users, but it's just one person, there's not a lot of assets you have to move around. The transaction was quick and clean. One of the advantages of the near ubiquity of Stripe at this point is we were able to build a lot of playbooks and processes around like, okay, this is how we do a Stripe transfer. Like, these are the roles we need. This is how we close books. This is how we do an audit. After Icon, we purchased a Google Chrome extension in the productivity space called Clipboard History Pro. Similar to if you've ever installed sort of like a Omni clicker, Omni paster kind of plugin for Mac OS. It's very similar within the Chrome, like gives you a history of when you copy and paste. And again, very, very different characteristic of the user base, where it's a massive free user base, but then some of the features are paywalled, as opposed to a dev tool where there's a bit of a free tier, but you're really driving people to upgrade quickly. And what we loved about that was just the audience size of it.
Yeah.
It was and is really, really beloved. There's a huge amount of top of funnel just through the Chrome Web Store. And it was a clear thing where the founder hadn't invested a lot in pricing strategy or feature strategy. It was, let me back into a product based on what I need out of a tool, and let me figure out a way to charge for it later. But it was clear that the amount of value capture relative to the actual revenue capture was pretty imbalanced. We saw that a lot of teams use this tool, but there was no team-specific pricing strategy. It was like a team of 20 people all paying $2 a month separately on independent invoices. We could quickly understand how to evolve the product, not in a way that did a disservice to users, but actually improved their day-to-day using. After that, we looked at a couple platform plays. One of them was shopping cart apps, a suite of integrations for the Shopify ecosystem. The Shopify ecosystem has so much buzz at this point. It's so, and I guess maybe this is a little bit less true now compared to say 12 or 18 months ago, but like very, very frothy. Like the Shopify playbook for how to foster and grow a third-party ecosystem, I think is pretty renowned at this point. And we just wanted to get a bit of a beachhead into that to see if it was a place where we want to invest more. We liked products that were almost in the integration side of things as opposed to expanding the surface area. So this app connects your Shopify SKUs. If you're a store that has, say, 100 or 200 or 300 specific products that you're trying to sell, it'll connect those to third-party ads marketplaces like Bing Shopping or Google, and just creates a connective tissue between those two. It was pretty small surface area. It was really easy to understand what it did. It was also pretty scalable in terms of going on both sides of that connective tissue. You can scale the Shopify side and add support for like WooCommerce or other e-commerce players. You could add more ads marketplaces because they all standardize on a similar feed. After that, we stayed within the platform space. And one of the really interesting sort of sectors that we like is workflow automation, especially how it relates to customer support. So things like Zendesk, Intercom, Groove. And we were chatting with a seller who we didn't get a deal with done on a previous transaction, but we ended up really, really liking just their approach. It was very in line with our thesis. And they had built a suite of Zendesk apps that just make it easier for customer support agents to get their day-to-day done. Is something they built, I think, back in 2017, and just very, very much fits the narrative I was talking about earlier, where it's like, here's this thing that I built over the course of a weekend. It's been growing steadily, but I haven't done anything with it since, and I just don't have the time to. We're like, well, we can provide some advantage. We can take strategic steps beyond making sure that invoices are paid. And then lastly, the largest transaction that we had, and I think the most fun, has been a SaaS in the art call management. If you're a smaller town or maybe a nonprofit that runs things like art fairs, you're probably using some sort of software on the back end to solicit calls for artists to submit their art and to give them booths and places to sell. And this is an app within that space where it was a founder scratching their own itch. They were working with their local town to create a solution for this back in 07 or 08. And through word of mouth and them just hammering away at the product for 5 years, they grew to a substantial market share. And then they were just bored. Like, they didn't have any passion programming. They didn't have any passion about the art space. They basically said they felt obligated to keep doing it. because it was bringing in a lot of cash, and they just reached a point where they were no longer interested in the space. They left it on autopilot for 5 years and then realized they could probably sell it and have a better outcome for themselves and the users. And that's been a really fun one because so much of my day to day is working with technically inclined users. And I think working in a space that is so underinvested in by the tech world, where the majority of folks we chat with, they're like 60, 65 years old. They're emailing us from AOL or Hotmail accounts. They don't care about any of the technological details. They just want to be able to get their art show working. And I think that's refreshing. It has forced us to change our perspective on how we do a lot of comms with our users. But it's also a good reminder of the technology is not the result in of itself. It is letting someone run a festival or run a fair or letting artists get compensated for their work. There's so much discourse about peak tech, and it feels like there's a startup for everything, like everything's getting disrupted. There's no new ideas. And this is an app that if my two partners and I had sat in a room for a month, like racking our brains around ideas, we would have never come up with this. But it's very profitable, very stable, very valuable. And I think it just goes to show that there's a lot of power in finding a niche and building and maintaining a product dedicated towards that niche.
No, that's amazing. And it's crazy how all this happened in such a short period of time. Since you've acquired those businesses, did they grow or improve according to how you guys strategized?
Absolutely. One of the things that we really learned quickly based on just reviewing financials, and that's one of the nice things about going through a brokerage or a platform like Acquired or Quietlight or FE, is you start to get attuned to a set of financials and like you can parse them pretty quickly. One of the things that was really important to us was really, really stable operating history. So like if anything said like AI chatbot, whereas this clearly has been around for like 6 months and is just powered. Yeah, exactly. Like this has to be a discard because you can't model that kind of business. Like you're buying a lottery ticket. And all of our purchases were based on roughly the sense that this will be financially strong as an investment if it just is stable. And we thought for across the board that we'd be able to improve these businesses. Like we wouldn't purchase an asset if we didn't think we could grow the business materially. But in terms of baseline that we were hoping for, that we were projecting on, really just hoping for stability. And all of them have grown at this point. They've all had in varying degrees of magnitude. They've all experienced growth, but it gave us a good amount of peace of mind that was like absent existential or platform level risk. This is still going to like work out from an accounting and financial perspective. We don't have to feel like as soon as we purchase this asset, we're on the clock to like materially drive things or else we're capital.
When you're looking at businesses, what is the quick things that you scan for? Like when I scan a resume for someone that applies at a company, I can just scan it pretty quickly and get a quick read. And then from there, decide if I want to dig deeper or not. When you're looking for stability, or what are the things that you quickly check for if you wanted to dive a little bit deeper?
The two biggest ones, one is quantitative and one is qualitative. The quantitative side is churn. Of the definition of good churn really does vary from sector to sector, but it's pretty clear like when a company has a churn problem, if you're seeing a lot of aggressive sort of like annual or multi-year prepays, or going back to sort of like the AI strawman a little bit, or if the company is so young that they can't really reflect or report on churn, that's just that was too risky or too volatile for our taste. We wanted to be able to see what is something that has at least 3 to 5 years of history that we can make a churn profile out of, and even transforming that into qualitative a little bit. When we chat with the sellers, if they can talk about churn in a way that makes sense, like bad churn in and of itself is problematic, but not disqualifying, especially if the seller can be like, yeah, we have a leaky bucket thing. It's 7-8% month over month. Here's what we would do to fix that, but I just don't have the time. Like that's a useful conversation as opposed to someone just being like, well, it's churn. Like sometimes people stop paying for the product. That was usually like, and some sellers were very flippant with that. That was usually a sign that it was like, there's something that does not feel worth pursuing pretty seriously on on this.
Yeah, I read through your lessons, and the thing that stuck out that's related to this was what percentage of revenue is actually using the product, which probably
Mhm.
circles back with very aggressive pricing
Yeah,
or discounting, or basically matching up who's paying for the product, who's actually using it, and trying to get that as high of a percentage as possible because it's solving some problem for them and they weren't tricked into paying for a product from the get-go. If
yeah,
you force a user to pay for a product right as they download the app, your churn is going to be really high
yeah.
because you're forcing them to pay for a product that they don't even know if they're going to use. And yeah, I think looking for stability of revenue over a long period of time. If a founder started over a weekend and it's just been growing at a steady clip over 5 years, you can assume that it's going to keep growing at that clip over the next 5 years if you don't make any substantial changes. And then all the added value that you would have on top of that as well. So,
Exactly. And to your point about usage, we were doing work on a business that we thought was pretty interesting overall and like had a very dense customer base where I think something like 70% of the revenue was coming from three firms, like three brand name logo firms that you would recognize in an instant. And we were like pretty excited, but also a little confused because it felt, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but it felt like a very dinky product. And we're like, this, I'm surprised to see that like there's so much revenue coming from these companies because it feels like there's a pretty easy inside sales playbook here. And we asked the sellers to send over some numbers, and it was very clear very quickly that exactly what you were describing took place, which was someone who had like a corporate card with like a tech lead or a VP eng at these kinds of companies signed up for a year. They used it for a couple weeks and then stopped. But like their revenue was still being recognized for the course of the calendar year. And it's like, oh, we have to like discount this in terms of valuing the business. They've basically churned. It's just they haven't literally churned from the next invoice yet.
yeah.
And it's also, I think I talked a lot about having comms with the seller be a really positive signal. Whenever we talked with counterparties and they didn't want to give us information, that was always like a very big alarm bell moment of we're always presenting ourselves in good faith. We're telling you what we want to do with the company, what our thesis is, all these things. And if you're not going to give us like the kind of data that we would be pulling day one of operations anyway, things that are trivial from a engineering labor standpoint to grab, like there's probably something deeper under the surface that we
Mhm.
need to either investigate or bail out of pretty quickly.
If you were to give me advice, right, and I said, hey, Justin, here's how I'm thinking about it. I want to buy a digital company that does about $1 million in revenue and ideally a small team size where there's obvious things to do with marketing and pricing, but also on the product side to streamline it. Where do I even start? How do I even have that conversation? What's the right price that I should buy for? What should I stay away from? What would be the lessons or the advice that you share with me if I went down the same journey as you?
Not to be cliche and throw it back at you, but I think this is the biggest piece of advice. And you sort of touched on, I think, what your answer will be here. Like really think about what you're trying to buy, what you're trying to do from a existential perspective, right? Of like, why do you want to buy this company? If it's to generate cash flow to sort of build a holdco, why do you want to do that? And so on and so forth. And the reason I say that is you're going to end up finding more opportunities that seem, at least at the surface level, pretty interesting, pretty
Mhm.
worth doing work on. And you need to have some sort of filter at the end of the day where it's like, well, this is probably a good financial asset. Does it match like the energetic asset, like the energetic cost that it's going to take for me to run this deal, to close it, to have it sitting in the back of my head for the indefinite future until I like sell it or shift someone over to GM it. Like, and I think that can be a hard question to answer. But the reason I say that is myself, Colin, and Harrison, we all agreed pretty early on that we knew what we wanted out of this as an enterprise, which was we weren't trying to give ourselves a second very stressful job. Like we all came from prior acts in life, whether
Yeah.
it was PE or big tech or M&A, where we had spent our time like focusing really, really hard to accelerate our careers and push ourselves and grow. And that was great, but that wasn't what we were looking for out of this new act of our lives. We wanted things that erred on the side of stability. And we said to ourselves, like, we're okay passing on businesses that look like they might have really, really high ceiling potential and could be incredible firms if we think that it's going to be a thing that dominates our life for like 3 to 9 months, let alone
Yeah.
longer than that. And so we biased really towards stability and risk aversion and just finding things where we're like, we have utmost faith in the operating history coupled with our ability to execute on them. And that like narrows down the field pretty significantly. If you have like specific targets, whether they're quantitative or like qualitative, like what you want to get out of this phase and like this practice, like I think that can be a really good wedge into understanding what are the kinds of businesses that will push me towards this versus what are the kinds of things that are financially they'll be good, but they'll also be net a distraction to the kind of life I'm trying to lead.
Oh, I think that's such great advice because I do browse on acquire.com or people forward me things. And if you look at first glance, you're like, oh, that could be a good opportunity. And then it's like, I'm going to give myself a stressful job on an idea that was not even mine. I have to go in and fix all of these issues. The questions that come to mind for me are build versus buy, right? I have a lot of experience taking things from 0 to 1. So for me, it's build versus buy is one aspect. Some type of craftsmanship slash style points is maybe another way. Is it something super interesting that I find interesting that I have a unique take on that can take it to the next level and improve it? For me, a lot of it's actually more product focused. I read through your lessons on marketing ops and pricing being easier to work on, but that was what I did at my last companies. I feel like the product side is exciting to be able to come to work every week, figure out what problems to solve, help design those features and simplify them. And I think if I had to pick a third one, I wouldn't want a super stressful job. Finding the intersection of all three of those things, I find it to be probably really difficult. But that is a good question that one should answer for themselves, not in just buying companies or for what they want to filter ideas and what they want to spend their time on. That's good advice.
I think on the sort of craftsmanship or ability to iterate on the product front, like really the way that translates directly into the kinds of companies that you'd be looking at is getting an understanding of what the developer velocity is like if it's a larger company where maybe you're prudent over developers in the deal or they have contracts in place versus maybe it's a slightly smaller operation and part of your first 90 days is like finding a contractor base or finding a dev firm who can iterate on it. the the things that I didn't really imagine doing in terms of technical due diligence, and I consider myself like a great engineer. Like I really liked digging into the technical side of all of these companies, but the number of terrific businesses, like very stable, great design in terms of user facing, great for users. But then you look at the code base and you're like, this is written in a variant of Cold Fusion that hasn't been supported in 15 years. Like there's some COBOL in here. That was a really big lever because when we looked at those kinds of businesses, we had to be like, well, the only way we're going to actually be able to make forward progress on the product, like on the core product, is total rewrite, or we luck into finding like a really good engineer that focuses in this specific dialect, as opposed to it being an asset when like, hey, here's this code base that's in Rails. Like the ability to find a Rails shop or like a React shop is so trivial compared to some of the more esoteric or complicated languages. And like having that be one of your principles, one of the things you want to get out of it is a super useful filter in that regard of like, you can look at businesses, read the sim and say, it seems great, but I'm not going to be able to like actually tweak the product that I'm pretty set in stone unless I want to do like a huge 6-figure capex to like rewrite whole swaths of it.
So considering that you're a very strong engineer, when you come across, let's say it checks the box, and then you lift the hood of the code base, you're like, whoa, I guess it's similar to renovating a house, right? But the difference is with
100%.
the code base, you can actually look at it, where a house, you're like, we won't know what's behind that wall until we buy the house and rip it open and see. How do you approach that? Because I would assume that every deal is going to have some hairy aspects of it. And I mean, I would assume most of the code for this is like if it was written over a weekend or barely maintained or outsourced, it's not going to look as great as the back end of some hardcore technical product at Stripe.
The framing we really landed on for it, because you're exactly correct, is there were businesses where the code value always exists on a spectrum. Like the code can be a really strong asset where, absent the business itself, the code is so well written that the ability to like iterate on it and change it and do A/B tests and all of these things is just that much easier. Versus total other end of the spectrum, code is a liability. Like absent the business value, just this code is bad, and the badness can manifest as security issues down the line, can manifest as inability to iterate on the products, like all of those things. And neither side of that spectrum was ever like disqualifying or qualifying. It was just a factor, right? When we looked at the business, we would look at the state of the code base, similar to the way we would look at a balance sheet of like, okay, well, this is a pretty strong business in many respects, but the code base is just a total piece of garbage. And that doesn't mean we're not interested in it, but we have to like think about what our operation with this would be and our value for this accordingly. Or conversely, like we could look at a business that we didn't quite like as much, but we said the code base is pretty solid. So we would be able to make some changes or improvements or improve the style of things much easier than a median business or building it from scratch type thing. That being said, I can't think of any business that we purchased that we didn't like at its core, but we liked like the backing technology enough to like make the plunge. And there were multiple businesses where we're like, we hate this code base, like we actively despise it, but it doesn't have any truly red alarm security issues, things along those nature. It was more just like, well, it's a really bad code base and it's gonna be hard to iterate on it. But knowing that, let's still plunge ahead, though it might change our mechanics of how we value the business or the contract we structure with the seller to make sure that we can have them on contract in a consulting capacity for 12 months to do more knowledge transfer and more rewrite.
Is there ever going to be a world where it'll be more efficient to rewrite everything in the same language, especially now with how much faster it is to code, to just streamline everything and say, hey, we're always going to be X. When we buy something, we're always going to factor in 3 months to rewrite it. So when we always iterate on the product, it's always going to be off of one language. Would you ever do that?
It's so tempting.
Yeah.
It's like, and the reason I say that is my partners and I had a discussion literally last night about one of these companies where we knew going in with the acquisition, like the code base was a bit of a liability, and we love the business, and we were sort of like, man, is there some tranche of this? Like, is there some specific feature that we can use as a wedge to partially rebuild in a way that is like pretty graceful? We can deliver value along the way, and then like slowly expand that out until we've kind of ship of Theseus the entire thing. We've rewritten it from scratch over the course of time. And I think the answer in reality is if we were to go through with that, we wouldn't do so evaluating the likelihood that we're actually rewriting the entire thing. Like that kind of project, that kind of operational investment has to be evaluated on its own merit. I think there is, just like in the sense of this sounds like a super trivial thing to do, but the first thing we did when we bought all of these companies was we migrated all of their help support software to the exact same vendor, because it's just like, it's very easy cost savings that adds up when you do that a handful of times of like, well, here's an extra $2,000 a month that we're not spending. And B, when we're training tier 1 support and like billing agents and those sorts of folks, having them have a single source of truth as opposed to having to like spin up documentation and SOPs for like 5 different types of like, you've got Zendesk and HelpScout and all of these things. It was just much simpler. And I think the same is true for a tech stack of when you think about owning and operating multiple businesses, having to isolate tech stacks and isolate engineers because one person knows Rails but doesn't know Django or vice versa, being able to say, hey, part of our evaluation criteria is we are only interested in like Rails companies, not because we think that is like the most efficient software or anything like that, but like that's where our proficiency is. That's where the dev shop that we've partnered with is really strong at, and we have a good relationship with them. And the incremental cost of adding a new tech language to our stack and to our portfolio, it's not disqualifying, but it is so high that the price that we have to command for that kind of business has to be much lower to compensate for it.
Yeah. Do you think going down an effort like that is becoming easier?
I definitely think it is easier today than it was 5 years ago. And I bet it's significantly easier 5 years from now than it is today. I think there's a lot of sort of discourse around the idea of the marginal cost of code approaching zero. And I don't know if it's ever going to hit zero, but I do think we're trending in that direction where the ability to make product or tactical decisions is growing relative to the power of implementation. I think the power of implementation is decreasing significantly. Like even just my own perspective, like I consider myself a day-to-day engineer in many respects. Whenever I'm coding, I'll use something like GitHub's Copilot, and
Yeah.
I'm just like way more productive than I was however many
Yeah.
years ago, let alone using some of the tools like I think for sales is V0, like some of the
Yeah.
programmatic generation tools that it's like you describe a login screen and it'll spin that up from scratch. Like
That's so crazy.
the ability to do that kind of stuff. And I think we're very, very much in crazy early days. Like, I honestly think a lot of the implementations that are around today, when we look at it a decade from now, it's going to look so trivial and childlike. I think we're progressing really, really quickly. So even if we're not there yet, I think the trend is pretty clear.
For a lot of the team members that work on the different companies that you acquire, are those like full-time or contractors? I think I've read that you guys you approach it very differently. How do you guys approach like staffing the right people for each one of those?
I think, and this goes back to the tech stack question a little bit. Right now, we don't have any full time hires. It's all contract folks. We'll have some people freelance and spread across multiple companies where that actually makes sense to do so. Of, hey, we're using the same SOPs and like customer support software and billing software, so you can jump between those. There's not a lot of switching costs. Less true on the end side, where it's just it makes more sense to have two different engineers or two different really strong ICs who have like one specific skill set that matches onto the tech stack, as opposed to having that blend. And that I think translates to a team perspective as well. One of the like more interesting, or I guess perhaps more idiosyncratic things that we did really want to do before spinning up the support function and spinning up the contractor function was for our first like 30, 60, 90 days, we wanted to get our hands really dirty. I think you learn a lot during diligence and during close about what operating these businesses are like from the seller. But there's so much that even when they're like being a very, very good counterparty, there's so much that they don't know to tell you because it's second nature to them. And it was really important for us to be like, we're gonna spend our time in the mines. We're gonna answer like customer tickets for a couple of months just to see what people are dealing with, what the actual cadence is like, and to also like help calibrate our understanding of what are the actual pain points with this. What are the things that people find really, really valuable? I think the term voice of customer is like a little cliche and a little overblown, but by far the most valuable time we spent post close was just hopping on Zooms with various customers and being like, we're the new owners. We want to know everything you think. Like the nitpickier, the better. And just having them rant at us for like 60, 90 minutes. It was always super valuable. And I think we've thankfully graduated from a lot of that at this point. But that really did drive a lot of our decision making, both in terms of staffing and prioritization of learning that, oh, here's this thing that looks like a support request, but is actually like a separate SKU we can build out and charge for. Like that's the kind of thing that we wouldn't have gotten if we had just like said day one, we're hiring out a support team to like triage and handle everything. You like getting some level of unfiltered fire hose of information from your users, I think is always time and energy well spent.
Yeah. And for Third South Capital, what is everybody working on it on the side? What is the end goal for that business?
In retrospect, it's very unfair of me to ask you the existential questions without having like a pre-canned or really strong existential answer myself. I think the biggest goal we had, frankly, for this first year of us doing it was figuring out if we liked it enough to keep doing it. Like we purposely orchestrated this with the three of us all being on the same page of like, there's a world where we hate all of this. Like we don't like having to spend an extra couple hours every week, like syncing on these different things and closing our books at the end of the month, like all the administrivia that comes from this. And maybe it's just not going to be as fun as we expect. So our first and most immediate goal was like, figure out if it's a thing we want to do long term. And I think a lot of our bets, both in terms of how we invested in the businesses, size of business that we were looking at, were more conservative to give us a bit of optionality of like bailing out and sort of like unwinding things a little more casually if we didn't want to continue doing it. We have thankfully realized that's not the case. We're having a blast. Financial returns are good. And I think from now we want to get to the point where we can scale up and do some of that cash flow reinvestment and grow the size of our overall portfolio without really changing what our day-to-day involvement is, which is exactly as you described. Like, it's all largely part-time. Like, this is not a thing where we're working 9 to 5 every day to like make sure all of the wheels are greased and all of those things. It's largely a, frankly, in the same vein as like a side project was for me a decade ago, is kind of our going involvement with a lot of this, and we want to keep that. I don't think any of us are dramatically interested in changing what our life looks like, but we want to just be able to do it with larger and larger impacts. The size of these businesses is less important to us in terms of financial return. I think more important just in terms of impact we can have on users and customers.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. What is revenue of all the businesses combined today? Or
Yeah,
raises?
right now we're a little over like 500,000 in terms of run rate. And I think we want to look at roughly that size of acquisition again, probably this coming year, just with the caveat that probably fewer businesses as opposed to more. I think all three of us would probably have a bit of a conniption if we woke up and we're like, we now own 10 businesses, because that's where you get to the point where just remembering the list of names becomes problematic, let alone like, what are the top 5 things we can do for each of these altogether?
Yeah. Shifting gears from buying companies to productivity and being a solo founder, how do you balance Third South Capital with Buttondown, which is the other company that you started or you built, versus buying?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And just as context, Buttondown, I very much started as a side project. It was like a nights and weekends thing until it grew to the point where I was like, I need to either sell this or work on it full time, because I've given myself a second job and I can't work this amount this sustainably. I think a lot of my philosophy boils down to this concept of sustainability above everything, where like my failure case is not being able to ship something at this specific point in time or like being able to hit this growth target, because everything I've done both on the Third South side and with my own projects like Buttondown have been cash flow positive since day one. So everything is oriented around, I want to make sure the way I live my life on like a day-to-day or month-to-month basis, I can do for the indefinite future. I'm not worried about burning out. I'm not worried about just like completely getting my head totally underwater. I need to structure my life so that like the things that ground me, which for me are like quality time with my family, like lifting, spending time with my dog, and reading, like those things are paramount. And with the remaining time that I allocate towards like work and craftsmanship and entrepreneurship, I'm spending that as tactically as possible. And a lot of that means saying no to stuff, which is one of those cliches that I didn't realize was true when I was in big tech. And now I'm just like, I feel like all I do is like say no to 12 things so I can say yes to like that 13th thing.
Yeah.
But like being really, really disciplined about that, with the knowledge that whenever you say no to a given project or idea or area of investment, it's more of a like, just not right this second. Like, I'm the kind of person, as you can probably tell with like all the stuff that's going on, that I get so excited about so many concepts and opportunities and ideas. It's really hard for me not to basically run around like a dog chasing his tail in many respects. Of like, if you give me a free afternoon, I'm going to get distracted by like 17 things. And the way I've found the right level of focus to actually execute on what I know are the top like 3 or 4 things that I have to do in a given time frame is once those things are set in stone, like nothing can budge them unless I'm getting like a call from my parents that the house is on fire. I have to stick to what is most important there. So I have the level of freedom and the level of sustainability and autonomy in all other aspects of my life.
Now that makes a lot of sense. Would you say you treat work equal as everything else, or is that the top priority when you look at sustainability?
I definitely wouldn't call it the top priority, but I think one of the big shifts in my life, I think leaving the industry was going from this concept of like work life balance where you have a part of you that is doing work to a part of you that is not doing work, and more
Yeah.
like in a given day it all like blends together to the extent that I might have an afternoon where I spend the morning like chatting with a couple folks on Buttondown. Then I have like a user chat. Then I go to the store. Then I like write an essay or read for a couple hours. Then I go onto a podcast and then I work some more. Like, is that a work day or like not a work day? It all like just shifts into the same mode in my head. I think the most important distinction I have, and I feel very privileged to say this, is like I don't spend my time doing things that I'm not interested in doing or like using my labor in a way that doesn't align with the things I want to build or the things that I want to change in the world. And from to that extent, like work and non-work feels like a false dichotomy because a lot of the things that I'm building, like I would be doing even if I didn't have a financial interest. I just find them personally gratifying or interesting. I'm just lucky that I've backed my way into, I don't know if you want to call it a career or entrepreneurship or what, but like it maybe this is the cliche way to phrase it. A lot of that stuff doesn't feel like work when I'm in flow on like a deep engineering problem or I'm like poking around pricing strategy for one of Third South's businesses. That doesn't like fall under a work bucket so much as like it's just an interesting way I get to spend my time, just like many of the other things that don't really involve capital or money or software.
Dude, there's so many gems in there. I think the false dichotomy is one between drawing a distinction between work and life and how you view it as just a blend throughout your day. And the other one that really stuck out to me for what you just said was around just doing interesting things. That's a similar mindset that I've found from talking to a lot of people on this podcast is that they just gravitate towards things that they find interesting, that they would have fun and derive a lot of joy doing. And if you could blend that with what you're working on, that's a really good formula or combination that a lot of people don't do. I think maybe it's because with a 9 to 5, it's like I just go get this paycheck. And then when I leave work, I can do all the things I want to do with my life, whether it's a side hustle or running a marathon or whatever it is. And what I find inspiring about how you approach your life is that you're just blending all those things together. And I'm pretty sure your days just fly by because you're just having so much fun.
The days are very, very quick. The years are short, but the days are quick is
Yeah.
probably how I would phrase it. And I 100% agree where when I graduated undergrad in 2013, like I didn't come from a big engineering school or anything. It was like a small liberal arts school in Virginia. And my understanding of like what it meant to work in tech was really one of two things. It was you go work at Microsoft, you're at a company with like 100,000 people and like you are like well compensated and you'll have a long career, but like you are very much a 9 to 5 person. Or you do like the super stereotypical startup thing of like you move out to Silicon Valley, you like raise a bunch of rounds, and you either burn out or you're a multimillionaire. Like there weren't any people that I knew of that was doing the sort of like in between of like creating whether you want to call it a lifestyle business or whatever, like having some sort of third option where you get to have a bit more agency over how you spend your time. You get to work on things that are interesting to you. It is riskier. Like I'm not going to pretend that there wasn't a part of me when I shifted to working on Buttondown full time. I was like, there's like a chance that all of this blows up in my face. And if that had happened, like we're still at a point in the industry where being a software engineer or having a good product sense is so valuable that you'll absolutely be able to find a new path, especially if you spent however many years cutting your teeth on like trying to hit product market fit and trying to scale a business. Like all of those are tremendously valuable skills. And I'm just like, I'm grateful that I was able to stumble into what in retrospect is like the most fulfilling way I can think of spending my days and spending my life. Of having to go back to the conventional 9 to 5 thing just sounds like pulling teeth at this point.
Yeah. One of the lessons I've learned is trying to find your path or just find anything in the middle of those, of any extremes, right? So learn that being on the extremes can be good for certain situations, but exploring some of the middle path is also pretty interesting or could be a better fit. And I think you're right. To have a fulfilling life is really having a lot of agency of how you spend your time. If you want to work at a big tech company and work on those products, that's perfectly fine too. But if you don't want to do that and you don't want to start a company and you want to have full control of your time doing something similar to what you're doing, working on interesting things with people that you want to work with on problems that you want to solve, and infusing all the other parts of your life that are important to just have a really great day, I think is really not talked about enough and undersold. We hear a lot of the tech founders and big companies and side hustles, but I think that's really inspiring, the way you view how you live your life.
Thank you. And I agree in terms of the growth side of things as well. And like there are years in my life I can look back and like I really pushed myself this year. Like when I was 23 and I was moonlighting and I was getting Buttondown off the ground, and if I were to like chart the amount of time I spent, it was super unsustainable. But for that point in my life, it fit with my goals. Right now, I don't think I have goals that are in the vein of like you're saying, like double the run rate of all of the businesses we own or things along those lines. My goals are really around like health and stability, and maybe 5 years from now, my priorities change. I think regardless of where folks are in their life, I think it's worth taking a step back and sort of thinking, what do I want to get out of a given year? Like, what are my big priorities, and how do I spend my time? How is that aligning with that as good as possible? I think
Yeah.
a lot of angst that I hear from sellers or folks early on in their career, regardless of if they're working independently, if they're at a startup, if they're at a big company, a lot of that angst just comes from a dissonance or a mismatch between where they want to go and what they value in life versus how they're currently spending their time. Like you said, I know dozens, hundreds of like good friends who are working at big companies who have like a 9 to 5, love their job, have no desires to move. And I think that's great. Like they're very aligned with what they want to get out of their careers, what they want to get out of their life. The pain just comes from the mismatch when someone is like spending all day daydreaming about, oh, I'd love to go snowboarding like every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, instead of like being in the status sync and like being able to choose my own hours, but they're not doing anything to push themselves in that direction.
I think that's such a great insight. And I think that expectation and that mismatch is what makes a lot of people really unfulfilled or unhappy with where their life is. And I think taking that first step to align those two things is pretty important for people to have a fulfilling life. To wrap up, my last question I have for you is really around your media consumption and how you track that, what benefits you see from it. I've heard of quantified self, but I've never heard anyone do it the way that you do it. And I found it so interesting.
For sure. So I am. I'll preface all of this with the fact that I am a massive dork, and that informs most of this practice. The director Steven Soderbergh, who did like the Ocean's 11 films and has done a lot of heist and crime films, does this thing every year where he publishes everything he read or listened to or watched, and just like some commentary on his decisions. And it's always just like a fun time capsule of the year. And I encountered this back in I think 2017. Thought it was a neat idea and started doing it, and just haven't ever stopped since. And the rules for myself are pretty simple, which is at the end of every day, like just as part of my evening wind down, I write like what I watched or what I played in terms of video games or what I read. And then whenever I finish something, I have to write around like 250, 500 words, like what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, what my thoughts were, any good quotes, that sort of thing. And it started out as like a pretty simple journalistic process, and like I was able to like build a little personal site about it so you can like click around and see all the things that I've read. But it's actually really fascinating to go back to like my prior self of 2 years ago and see like what I was listening to or what I was reading and what I was consuming a lot, and really transport myself back there. Like it's a weirdly powerful trigger in a way that I think people won't expect. And it also forces me to be much more mindful about what I'm consuming from a media standpoint. When I'm left to my own devices, I will eat low calorie food. Like I will watch whatever game show is on TV. I will just turn on like the latest NBA game. I will play like a phone game. It's rarely as fulfilling as like here's a book I've always wanted to read, and I know I'm going to read it, but like I have to go grab it from the study downstairs, and that's a bit of a hassle. Or like here's this movie that I've been meaning to watch for a while, and it's going to like take a little more getting into than just like rewatching one of my old favorites, but I know it's going to be rewarding. And almost like quasi gamifying it for myself and making it be a bit more mindful of a practice every time I turn on the television or I open a book, as opposed to it being a almost defeatist thing of like, well, I need to be entertained for something, so let me like consume something and get some dopamine, has been super rewarding. I feel like almost all of the really great literature, really great films that I've encountered over the past couple of years have largely come from this practice of like being much more mindful and much more diligent about, I want to pay attention to what I'm putting inside my body, for lack of a better metaphor, and really respond to it and engage it, and not just be like, well, that was a good movie, on to the next one. It's not super high flying in terms of technology or anything. Like I use Obsidian for it now, but the tool doesn't really matter. It's just, I think, the practice of like having some sort of durable thing that you can visit over a long period of time. And it's just fun to see
Yeah.
all of my trends and my tastes develop.
What was the one piece of content that you consumed last year that like had such a profound impact?
Oh man.
Thing that you learned about yourself?
So I'm going to go with the first one.
Okay.
And it was a book that I had on my reading list forever, and I bounced off of it the first couple times I tried to read it, and then on the third time it finally stuck and is now probably my top 5 or 10 favorite books, which is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. He's I believe a Spanish author, but it's a period piece. It takes place in a Francescan abbey in like the 1400s. It's like part mystery, part meditation on like the importance of the written word and like how we learn about meaning through how people communicate with each other. And it was this like really, really dense, really, really fascinating novel that I just absolutely loved. There are some books that you are excited when they're done, and then there's some books where you put it down and it's just sticking with you for like months on end afterwards. And this was very much in the latter of, I always respect a book that can do both things. It can be a really gripping and entertaining read on its own merits, and is then also bursting with ideas that sort of linger and fester in your brain long after they're gone. Like there are great like Agatha Christie style entertaining books where it's very fun, but there's not much depth there, and there's like really great abstract literature, really good like theoretical literature, where you're not having fun reading it, but it gives you new ideas and new concepts to attack the world with. And this was one of the rare cases where you get both. Like you get a lot of ways to reshape your thinking about what it means to live in a world and what it means to live in a society, while still having a terrifically entertaining sort of like whodunit style thriller. It was just
Got it.
a total blast.
Check it out. Well, cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Justin. It was really great to hear your story. Very inspiring. Love what you're doing at Third South Capital and how you live your life. And I'm going to start tracking my media consumption. Hopefully it's not all TikTok videos or Instagram Reels. But I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find you online?
They can find me on Twitter at jmduke, or they can always send me an email. I'm justin@buttondown.email.
And I'm assuming anyone that's interested in selling their company can reach out to you as well.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.